Thank you so very, very much. And what a pleasure it is, what a joy it is to welcome all of you to the Archdiocese of Baltimore, to our Premier See for this, the 2017 edition of the Mid-Atlantic Congress. We gather together today blessed as living witnesses. Blessed as living witnesses to the goodness of God, the creator of all that is. We are gathered together as living witnesses to the redeeming love of Jesus Christ, the Word through whom all things were made. We gather today as living witnesses to the power of the Holy Spirit who renews the face of the earth. And so on behalf of my hardworking colleagues in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, and on behalf of the Association of Catholic Publishers, I truly want to welcome you very, very warmly. I'm so glad you're here, and I pray that these days that lie ahead will be full of grace, full of insight, and full of power, so that we may emerge from the Mid-Atlantic Congress more convinced than ever that we are called to be living witnesses. Over these next days, we will gather some 1,500 strong. Many are right here from Baltimore, but many also are from surrounding dioceses, and some are from dioceses that are near, and some a little farther. I want you to know just how welcome you are in this Premier See. We're also blessed by the presence of a number of bishops. I would just like to mention, in addition to Archbishop Wilton Gregory, whom I shall introduce in a minute, we are blessed with Archbishop Timothy Broglio of the Archdiocese for the Military Services, Archbishop Leonard Blair, the great Archdiocese of Hartford. We are blessed with Bishop John Michael Bodian of the Eparchy of St. George in Canton, Bishop W. Francis Malooly of Wilmington, and an old Baltimorean. It's always good to have you back. In addition to that, our own Bishop Madden and Bishop Parker is with us from the Archdiocese, and from Camden, Bishop Dennis Sullivan. Let's express our thanks to them and to their staffs for their presence. And what a joy it is, what a privilege it is to have with us today Archbishop Wilton Gregory. I've known the Archbishop a long, long time, and I was delighted when he accepted the invitation to be our keynote speaker today. As most of you know, Archbishop Gregory is a native of Chicago. He attended Quigley Preparatory Seminary and Loyola University, that is in Chicago, and St. Mary of the Lake Seminary. He was ordained a priest in 1973 for the Archdiocese of Chicago, and he earned a doctorate in liturgy from San Anselmo in Rome in 1980. And in addition to serving in various pastoral roles and serving the archbishops of Chicago, he also taught liturgy at St. Mary of the Lake Seminary, and on December the 13th, 1983, was ordained auxiliary bishop of Chicago, and I think he was 35 or 36 years old, clearly the youngest bishop in the country at the time and maybe ever. So that's pretty good. That's awfully young to have such a terrible thing happen to you.
Yes.
In 1994, he was installed as the 7th Bishop of Belleville, Illinois, and since 2005, he's been serving as the Archbishop of Atlanta, one of our truly great archdioceses. He was also the president of the Bishops' Conference back in the early 2000s during a challenging time, and he led us with great insight, and he is recognized not only in the United States, but far beyond, as one of the truly great leaders of the Roman Catholic Church. Let's give Archbishop Wilton Gregory a warm Baltimore welcome. Thanks so much,
Thank you very much, Archbishop Lori, for your kind invitation to share in this very happy and important time in the life of the Archdiocese of Baltimore and all of the local churches that are here gathered and represented by its faithful, its clergy, and the bishops who are here with us today. God saw how good it was. That special phrase appears 6 times in those opening passages of the book of Genesis, as the sacred text describes how the Lord God was obviously admiring his works of creation. It is now our spiritual and moral obligation to see how good it is. The created world that God has now entrusted to our care. It's not merely good because it is profitable or usable or exploitable. First and foremost, it is good because it reflects God's goodness itself. In the very act of creation, God was bestowing upon all of nature an undeniable reflection of his own divine goodness. The apex of that reflection is to be found in the women and men entrusted with God's handiwork. Human beings are God's creation that most perfectly reflects his own divinity. If we are to begin to safeguard God's creation, we must launch an increased reverence for every human life. We must be so grateful for those whose concerns for the planet draw our attention to its fragility. Yet we must first safeguard human life as the very starting point of environmental security. The life of human beings enjoys a priority of importance in the environmental concerns because those who have been entrusted with the care of creation must themselves be safeguarded in order to accomplish our divine assignment of caring for his creation. Our respect for human life, however, can never be limited exclusively to a life within the womb, but it must also extend to those who may now be prisoners, who are guilty of horrendous crimes, those who may be frightened immigrants, including those with or without documentation, the mental or emotionally fragile, and the too often neglected poor, who may be seen as inconvenient, but who nonetheless are our brothers and sisters in the Lord Jesus. For the past several years, our nation has faced a tragic eruption of widespread violence that has directly impacted the African American community, as well as the law enforcement communities in too many different locations, including this beloved city of Baltimore. The violence has been such that neighbors have been put on edge, and the serenity of residential areas has been threatened and interrupted. This explosion of violence has shaken our national sense of well-being. We Americans have begun to discuss our common future as though the civil rights achievements of the past generation had not even taken place. Our public language has grown so more severe and offensive. Some people have begun to question, if not even to doubt, our future as a home community, unified by a sense of national identity. This unfortunate reality resulted in the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops asking for a conversation regarding this regrettable state of affairs. I was honored to have chaired a dialogue to facilitate a plan of action for this state of affairs, and then to make recommendations to the full body of bishops with the results of that conversation. I am happy to report that Archbishop William Lori and I have worked closely to advance this conversation. He has been a bright light in promoting the pursuit of peace and reconciliation that has addressed the quality of life and its future here in the Archdiocese of Baltimore. And I consider our collaboration a true sign of the respect of human life and dignity that is so deeply needed. His leadership in inviting our ecumenical and interfaith partners in responding to the violence that erupted in this local church are signs of hope that all such behavior is indeed contrary to God's ultimate design for our relationships with one another. You are very fortunate to have him as your servant minister at this moment in our common history. The environment and the increasing concerns of ecology have received intensified attention over the past decades because of too many examples of the destructive exploitation and the wanton damage that human beings have done to what God first saw as very good. He created the universe and the people that he fashioned to tend it. In 1972, Franco Zeffirelli brought Hollywood star power to the life of St. Francis of Assisi in his epic film, Brother Sun, Sister Moon. The very title itself comes from the much celebrated canticle that Francis himself composed in 1224. The canticle also provided the title for Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, which is focused on the environment whose beauty, fragility, and potential we are invited to reflect upon today and during this Congress. St. Francis of Assisi has long been identified with possessing an inspiring, mystical, and loving relationship with all of created nature. He tamed vicious wolves, preached to birds, and even spoke to the sun and the moon. Francis of Assisi had become a 13th century ecologist without his even knowing it. He praised God for everything that God had created, and Francis placed himself in relationship to all of creation by seeing divine splendor in all of nature. Francis saw God's fingerprints throughout every element of creation. I suppose that St. Francis would be shocked to see how God's splendid generosity in fashioning the world in which we live has now come too often to be desecrated and exploited. How could our beloved sister, Mother Earth, come to be so threatened by science and technology and greed, so that her treasures are exploited and hoarded by the rich and powerful when they were divinely intended to sustain us all? How could our sister water become so polluted and defiled that she increasingly cannot be found fresh and pure and available to quench the thirsts of all the creatures who depend upon her for life itself? We need to recall Francis of Assisi today and ask him to rekindle within each one of us a share of his profound spirit of wonder, awe, and gratitude for God's creation. Without the benefit of our modern scientific acumen and expertise, St. Francis was able to view all of nature as a precious treasure that God has entrusted to us to be shared and preserved for those who will follow us. Francis of Assisi believed in the truth of the book of Genesis when it repeatedly reminds us that at the very moment of creation, God saw everything that he had fashioned as something very good. We pause today as a recommitment to the work of caring for our common home and carefully preserving those gifts that God has given to us and through us to generations to come. While the task of respecting God's creation is entrusted to each one of us, we also know that we must work in collaboration with men and women of goodwill everywhere to achieve our goals of ensuring that this planet is both cherished and sustained. In that regard, the dioceses from this region are deeply grateful for the opportunity to gather in reflection and to pledge themselves to work collaboratively and generously with others to develop our response plans to Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. Such collaboration is the only way that we can work together successfully to care for our common home. The Archdiocese of Atlanta was singularly blessed to partner with the University of Georgia's Environmental Department in Athens, Georgia, to prepare and promulgate a local response plan to Pope Francis's encyclical. The initiative for this collaborative effort came from a university professor, even in anticipation of the issuance of the encyclical. Dr. Susan Varlamov immediately saw the potential of bringing the academic world into direct dialogue with the Pope's planned message in such a way that what the world of science knew about the environment would highlight and strengthen the spiritual and moral message that Pope Francis would proclaim. Our Archdiocesan Pastoral Plan is the result of Susan's important and anticipated preparation for the Pope's encyclical. And I remember getting a phone call from one of our parishes, and the pastor there says, "There's a wonderful woman who works at the university in Athens, and she insists on seeing you. I'm glad I let her in the office. There are many of you here in this conference today whose love and concern for our planet home takes many different expressions, both from a professional and a personal perspective. On this day, we all gather together in prayer and in hope that the work of ecology and scientific research will result in greater protection for this planet. Francis of Assisi regularly praised God for creating the entire world of nature. We make his prayer our own today, so that working together and praying together, we might preserve what God has given us and tend it much more carefully, as God would have us do. Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si proposes an integral ecology that seeks to draw the diverse expressions of creation's dignity ever closer to the dignity of all men and women. He writes to remind us that we are the custodians of creation and not to be its exploiters. For creation still belongs ultimately to God himself, who entrusted to us for our well-being and the well-being of future generations. God's creation invites us to enter into a threefold relationship with God, with one another, and with nature itself. Each of these relationships is interconnected, and ultimately they are intended to enhance and to strengthen each other. It was Francis of Assisi's extraordinary ability to see and to treasure the relationships between God, creation, and other human beings that adds to his stature as a truly holy man. He not only reverenced nature, he also saw God's creation in a holistic way, as he spoke of brother sun and sister moon, inanimate celestial objects that enjoyed a special place in the saint's life. We too are called to value creation in this reverential fashion and not to view nature as simply objects to be exploited for their fiscal value or for our pleasure. Francis also, in an era in which men of the earth were preparing for crusades, was open to dialogue with the Muslim world. Francis was way ahead of his time. Pope Francis is not the first pontiff to call our attention to the issues facing the environment or to challenge us to safeguard the things of this world in a more conscientious way. Pope Benedict XVI actually had solar panels installed on structures in the Vatican as a measure not simply to conserve energy or as a money-saving gesture, but to stand as an example of being more attentive to the limited resources that we must all preserve. Pope Francis, in reconstituting several Roman dicasteries on January 1st of this year into a single agency, chose to name the new structure a dicastery for the promotion of human integral development. The name highlights the importance of seeing the links between social, political, charitable, and environmental issues. The new dicastery combined 4 former offices as a way of drawing together the works that were heretofore the activity of 4 separate Vatican agencies. This reconfiguration is another example of focusing on the interrelatedness of human activity and of our connection with all of nature as well. The one portion of humanity that is especially and directly impacted by the destruction of our environment are those who are poor, those who have the least ability to halt or to modify the exploitation of the natural resources that sustain us all. Much of the encyclical Laudato Si describes the perilous situation of the people whose lives are directly tied to the earth and its care. We all depend upon the health of the climate and the resources of the earth. But the poor, in particular, seem to suffer most when God's creation is abused. Without the means to change the ruination of the climate or the fragile condition of the earth, the poor frequently have their lives completely subjected to the whims of industry that destroy forests, pollute streams and rivers, and ravage the landscapes upon which the poor depend. God's creation can replenish itself, but not as quickly as the international corporations and interests can manage to deplete it. Some natural resources have already been so squandered that they may already now be lost for future generations. There are those who question or even deny the dire description of Earth's current conditions. Some maintain that human intervention and exploitation are not, in fact, the causes of changes in climate, destruction of the balance of nature, or even the loss of entire ecosystems. The evidence seems to be incontrovertible that we human beings are no longer carefully tending the world that God saw as very good, but wasting and destroying the very means of life for future generations. Almost daily, we see media coverage of the life-threatening pollution of air quality in too many places across the globe. The radical destruction of forests that not only help regenerate breathable air, but also secure and anchor the very earth that can then produce crops that feed the entire globe is an acknowledged fact. Francis of Assisi lived 800 years ago, and many of the places in the world that may now be at risk were still unknown to him or to peoples of his world, who were then living a world away. Francis would not have envisioned the power of modern-day machinery and technology that now make it possible to actually visit Sister Moon and to harness the energy from Brother Sun and Sister Wind. Our contemporary scientific acumen would no doubt astonish Francis of Assisi, as would our often reckless treatment of God's creation. Pope Francis encourages us to encounter others in many different settings, including in the work of preserving our environment. We encounter those who are most directly affected by the misuse of nature, as well as those who have the capacity to change the course of human behavior's use of this planet. Francis of Assisi and his namesake at the Vatican stand as shining examples of people who take the opening words of the book of Genesis literally and who challenge us to do the same. They invite us to see and to respect the grandeur of God's creation, beginning with the lofty dignity of the human person and our divinely inspired responsibility to care for the world in which God has entrusted to us. This earth is the new garden in which we are to discover not only the means for our survival, but a reflection of the very face of God himself, so as to be able to declare that truly all that God has fashioned is good, holy, and precious indeed. Thank you very much.